was rocked by the publication of a book by one of its young stars, the Reverend Ron Bell, young pastor to a megachurch in Michigan. It was called Love Wins, and its core idea is that God so loves the world and his children that one way or another, in the fullness of time, God will get us all back in heaven with him. No one will suffer eternally in hell. Before Love Wins was even published, hyperactive Christian bloggers who hadn't even read it yet denounced it as a heresy. The heresy of, are you ready? Rampant universalism. Yes, and it got to be such a buzz that for a few days, universalism was a #1 keyword on Twitter. Can you imagine? Now, you members of First Unitarian sometimes have a hard time remembering this, but we are Unitarian Universalists. The Unitarians and the Universalists, two American denominations dating back to colonial days, merged 50 years ago, just after the formation of this church, which was founded as a Unitarian church. Since there were no Universalist churches here in New Mexico, and we Albuquerqueans know something of the perils of having a long name that no one can spell, this church never formally added the Universalist name to our already challenging one. However, the figure on our mural, the central figure, that's why I'm over here today, so more of you can see this central figure, which was done in 1964, is the symbol of the merger. The Unitarian flaming chalice merging with the Universalist symbol of a cross set off center in a circle. We are Unitarian Universalists, all 120,000 of us in our 1,000 American congregations, hardly a blip on Twitter from the moment of its founding until last March. Not that it was really us that was #1 on Twitter in those days. It was universalism with a small u that was all being hyperactively discussed. The idea of universal salvation, the theological idea that everybody is saved. This idea and experience of God's love has existed all throughout history from the beginning of Christianity, though it was first called a mystery before it was called a heresy. It galvanized some Christians in 17th century America into forming Universalist churches, which were often the megachurches of their day, but which, as mainstream Protestantism began to less and less emphasize hellfire and damnation, seemed to lose its focus, shrank, and eventually entered into a merger with its old nemesis, the Unitarians, who had their own reasons for burying a hatchet and just getting along. That's another interesting story of politics and religious sociology, not for this morning. This morning we're going to focus on universalism, the idea that everybody is saved. Reverend Ron Bell says that he's not a heretic. Of course, most heretics say that. And he also, in the end, insists that he's not a Universalist. He does not believe, he says, that when we die, we all go immediately to heaven whether we want to or not, and enjoy bliss with a God we either rejected or never knew or didn't obey. Nope, he says, he doesn't believe that. Our 19th century Universalist forebears would nod sagely and remark that all he's really saying here is that he is not a death and glory Universalist. Most of them didn't consider themselves death and glory Universalists either, although there was that faction of our free faith. Most Universalists considered that an extreme and unrealistic idea. Most Universalists believed in a sort of a reform school model of the afterlife, that hell was a place that some went after death if they needed it, not to be punished, but to stay until they saw the error of their ways, or grew up, or learned to get along. They were content with the idea that the details of this were a mystery. As a group, the Universalists had a very open sense of the spiritual life. That's why they put their Christian cross off-center in that circle. The center, they felt, is a mystery. The details, history, culture, and beliefs that make us Christians, they thought, were important but secondary. Their belief in God's unending love caused them, as it has caused Ron Bell, to reject traditional ideas about hell. Rob Bell also claims that he's not a universalist because, he says, universalist means you can believe anything you want, that beliefs don't matter. I was quite startled to read that, and even more startled to see its definition in the Christian Century, which is a reputable, even scholarly magazine. But you can believe everything you want, it doesn't matter, is not universalism, it's nihilism. Real universalists and Unitarian Universalists think it is very important what a person believes. Important in this life for ourselves, for our communities, for our future, and for humanity's future. Reverend Bell, it seems to us, is backpedaling to avoid being associated with a concept which Christians have had difficulty with since the first councils of the Church. The rub is that while most Christians have proclaimed that God is a God of love, and it is clear that Jesus believed in a kindly, fatherly sort of God, there are biblical passages which seem to indicate a separation after death of the sheep and the goats, the good and the evil, even a few purported to be Jesus' own words. Christians have had difficulty with the concept of universalism because one thing that Jesus is reported to have said is, "I am the way and the truth and the light, and no one comes to the Father but by me." It's too bad that such lovely poetry was appended to such a problematic statement. It's caused a lot of problems for Christians who otherwise do believe in a God of love. And ever since, because one way or another, an awful lot of good people don't walk the Jesus path, and it seems that a loving God would just have to make allowances. Bell himself tells a story of an art show that had been put up in his theologically conservative but very socially engaged church, where human liberation is a value that they really care about. This particular piece of art depicted Gandhi, and someone put a sticky note on it saying, "Reality check, he's in hell." This caused Reverend Bell to indulge in a ministerial rant. Really? Gandhi's in hell? He is? We have some confirmation of this? Somebody knows this for sure, without a doubt, and that somebody decided to take on the responsibility, in my church, of letting the rest of us know? Of all the billions of people who ever lived, will only a select number make it to a better place, and every single other person suffer in torment and punishment forever? Is this acceptable to God? Has God created millions of people and over tens of thousands of years who are going to spend eternity in anguish? Can God do this, or even allow it, and still claim to be a loving God, he writes? What kind of faith is that? Or more important, what kind of God is that? And to that rant, our Universalist forebears would say a rousing amen, and many, many young Christians of Bell's generation would say, awesome. These Christians would point out that almost all the pictures that we have in our head about hell, red devils, heat, pitchforks, all that sort of stuff, they come from pagan mythology, not from the Bible. And while Jesus did say one thing that might indicate a separation of believers and non-believers at death, and several things that might indicate a separation of people who love their neighbors from those who don't at death, most of what Jesus preached was a God of love, who welcomes prodigals home, who forgives younger sons for squandering their inheritance and older sons for being prigs, who talks to outcast women at wells and honors immigrant travelers who rescue mugged strangers, who was kind to his doubting disciple who couldn't quite wrap his head around a resurrection even when he saw it with his very own eyes. A Jesus who, in short, preached for 2 solid years one unified message, which is pretty well summed up in the words, love wins. Oddly enough, our tiny denomination is one of the very few who've taken up the challenge of universalism in 2,000 years. And I, for one, welcome all the company we can get. Reverend Bell, you are too a universalist. Welcome to this great theological tradition. Please be seated. We sing that him in honor of the Quakers, the Society of Friends, the other Universalist denomination of the Americas. Everybody's saved. Really? How about Osama bin Laden? What about him? What about the ones who don't want to be saved? Who feel they don't need to be saved? Plenty of those here, I'm sure. Certainly not from or for that old white guy in the sky. And what difference does it make anyway? Universalism never caught on in the Christian world because many people seem to run their lives on a crime and punishment model. They believe to the bottom of their hearts that people follow rules to avoid punishment, and that if you take away the punishment, all hell will break loose. Such an ingrained part of such a large proportion of the population that early American Universalists in many locales were not permitted to serve on juries or in any position that required the taking of an oath because of the popular perception that if you didn't believe in hell, you couldn't be trusted to keep your word. Even many Unitarians believed that in early American days. Old-fashioned as this may sound to you, there still is a very strong ethos in this nation. We see it all around us, this crime and punishment model that assumes that people need the threat of punishment to keep them in line, working hard, obeying the rules, and so on. The package of legislation called No Child Left Behind partakes heavily in this ethos, for instance. So does the package of practices called the War on Drugs. Universalists noting that in loving families, most children actually can be guided into a reasonably good life, believe that God's love would similarly guide us all home eventually, maybe perhaps with the help of a little tough love in the difficult cases. They took that eventually seriously, most of them, out of general respect for the breathtaking evil that is possible in our human world. Their answer to the question, even bin Laden, would simply have been, yes, in the fullness of time, even bin Laden. Everybody's saved. Everybody's loved. And you may ask what difference any of all this makes, especially for you youths who don't believe in God, loving or otherwise. Who cares about these old theologies and heresies and a generational revolution going on in the evangelical world where most young Christians are actually Universalists? Firstly, because it really does matter what people believe. Universalism, even though it is about pie in the sky by and by, has important corollaries in the here and now. The idea that human beings are fundamentally divided into the saved and the damned, the people that God is going to reward and the people whom God is going to torture or at least turn his back on forever, that division of people in the hereafter gives us permission to divide people up here on earth. It makes it seem natural and okay and just in the nature of things that some people will never be able to earn a living wage, or that kids whose parents brought them here from another country can't go to a public college, or that some people can't marry while others can, or that the way to deal with criminals is to lock them up and throw away the key, because after all, that's what God does. Universalism puts the kibosh on all that kind of thinking. If God, with infinite love, loves everybody, even the criminal, the non-believer, the ne'er-do-well, then as best we can, that's what we're supposed to do. All of us are loved ends up meaning all of us are welcome and all of us belong. The theology of universalism supports justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships. It's no accident that 19th century Universalists founded colleges for everybody in the days when many people thought that only the elite needed college, and ordained a woman to the ministry in 1863. Everybody's welcome means what it says, after all. And I think the world needs more of that, don't you? Therefore, I am very pleased to see the evangelical world rocking to a discussion of this big idea. I think that it can only be good for society at large for there to be a little more inclusivity and a little less dividing people up into those people I'm supposed to care about, like God does, and those I can turn my back on. I think it's good for the evangelicals to be grappling with this big idea. And we need to keep grappling with it too. One measure of a theological idea is how big it can get and how deep it can go into the world. Whether it can be believed both literally and figuratively, because there will be people who do both. Whether it can inform a believer's life and earn the admiration of a non-believer. Whether it makes a difference not only in people's inner state, but in their better world. Universalism is one of those really big theological ideas. It doesn't stop with the literal idea that everybody gets into the pearly gates. There is an atheistic universalism, a mystic universalism, a humanistic universalism, and a very practical kind of universalism, the kind that says, to heck with debating to beliefs, I'm just going to get to work. Because you see, when you take out all that concrete imagery of pitchforks and pearly gates, universalism means that we all have a common destiny. We are all fundamentally one. Whether you believe that that fundamental oneness and the rights that it implies and the care that it demands has its origin in God's love or in human goodness, a common end in heaven or a common end in the light or a common end in death, the important thing to universalism is that we're all in the same boat. We're all fundamentally one. We all have the same needs, the same rights, the same feelings and similar potential to do good and evil, to love and to hate. It means that the obligation of justice is to make the world a better place where everybody can have a decent life, to extend ourselves in love as widely as we can. All one. All deserving of some fundamental rights, some basic respect, a little space, and somebody's love. Even if we have to prevent them from doing harm, we do it humanely. Even if we can't believe what they want us to believe, we honor what we can. Even if we can't save their lives, we offer our care. And when that's just too hard for us, when we're hurt or angry, too hurt or too angry to live up to our ideals, or too hassled and too self-absorbed, we know the sadness of failing our ideals. We pick ourselves up and we begin again, just like everybody else. All one. All of us are loved. No one is an outcast, at least not forever, because loving people or a loving God or the tuggings of our own hearts pull us back into the trajectory of growth and community that is our natural place. No one is a stranger. All of us are loved. And our gratitude for that pours back into our lives, touching those around us, giving meaning and purpose to our work for justice, inclusion, and community for all the world's people. That's the salvation we're responsible for. And it's for everybody too.